Would you take your Bibles and turn to Matthew chapter 7? We are coming quickly to the conclusion of our little series on the Sermon on the Mount. While you're turning there, I'll tell you two stories. Number one, thank you for all your prayers for my cataract surgery this week. It went very well. It was my right eye. It still stings. My vision's a little blurry, but it's better than it was, and so we're making progress. And also, let me say, I'm very happy to be here with the Emmanuel Youth Group this morning. I'm very happy. So anyway, apparently I can't really see. That's the first thing. Second thing, I was on staff at the First Baptist Church of Yucaipa, California for about 2.5 years. I was the evangelism discipleship guy. And we had on our staff an executive administrative assistant, also known as a secretary, and I will not use her name, but this woman, I found out after I left the church, was really nasty. Not to the face of anybody on staff, a pastoral staff, but to the other support staff people, other secretaries and executive assistants. She was crucifying the staff behind their back all the time. And she would do it on the phone. She would do it in her small group. She would do it on all kinds of occasions. And it was really distressing. They finally discovered this about her about a year or so after I had left the church and taken another pastorate. And they fired her on the spot after they'd gathered all kinds of evidence. And it was incredible. But she just picked especially the staff apart. And it was distressing for me because on a couple of occasions I would confide in her about frustrations related to this or that, like sometimes you do on a staff. And apparently she would turn around then and tell a whole bunch of other people what I told her, and it would make me really look bad in the process. So I didn't really appreciate that a whole lot. Well, guess what? Jesus talks about people who do that kind of stuff in Matthew chapter 7, the first part of the chapter. What we find here is that Jesus actually teaches what looks like a bunch of disconnected and unconnected sayings and teachings, but I think that there's an overarching theme here. He has said previously in the Sermon on the Mount that the people of God need to be a certain way. They shouldn't be ostentatious in their exercise of religious activities. They should be doing stuff privately and anonymously and things like that. They shouldn't be standing on a street corner drawing attention to themselves. They need to be praying sort of a certain way. They need to have certain values and behaviors that go along with being ready for the coming of the Messiah. And so what we find in chapter 7 is how we ought to interact with people who aren't doing those things. How we need to be treating them when they don't act the way they should. What we're going to find here is that Jesus presents 4 attitudes that will help us know how to respond to others when they don't act appropriately in how they live, even if they're among the people of God. So here's the first attitude, verses 1 through 5 of Matthew chapter 7, and that is, we should not be judgmental. We shouldn't be judgmental against them when they don't act appropriately. And part of the reason for that, as Jesus will say in verses 1 and 2, is that we're going to be judged if we are judgmental. We're not going to get away with that. Jesus says in chapter 7, verse 1, do not judge, lest you be judged. Now, the thing, and by the way, I don't know if you guys are like me, every once in a while, when I have to confront people with some things in their lives that aren't so good, you want to do that lovingly, but we have to do that firmly. Sometimes we have to do that. I have heard more than a few times this expression, you can't judge me. And a lot of times they're thinking of this verse, don't judge, lest you be judged. Well, I just want you to know that this verse does not eliminate the necessity that we have to be discerning on occasion. It does not mean that we are to suspend all critical and discerning thinking about others. In fact, in chapter 7 and verse 6, in what follows here, Jesus is going to talk about the need to discern who the dogs are and who the pigs are. We're not going to throw our pearls before swine or give that which is valuable to a dog. Well, guess what? He's not talking about animals there. He's talking about people. And so we have a need to be discerning about the sort of individual a person might be and how we might interact with them. And so we're not talking about doing away with all sorts of discernment or even analytical or critical, not in a nasty way critical, not necessarily, but critical thinking about somebody. In 7:15, which we'll get to next week, Lord willing, Jesus talks about discerning who the false prophets are. Well, so you have to be able to judge some. So what is it that he does actually mean here? What is it that he means? John R.W. Stott, in his great little treatment of the Sermon on the Mount called Christian Counterculture, sort of specifies what Jesus means here. He writes, "If, then, Jesus was neither abolishing law courts nor forbidding criticism, what did he mean by judge not? In a word, censoriousness." Now that's a really big word that Stott uses. You know, the guy's a Brit, so he can use big words like that and get away with it. Censoriousness is nasty fault finding. Did you guys get that? Nasty fault finding. That's what censoriousness is. The follower of Jesus is still a critic in the sense of using his powers of discernment, but not a judge in the sense of being censorious, nasty fault finding. Censoriousness is a compound sin consisting of several unpleasant ingredients. It does not mean to assess people critically, but it does mean to judge them harshly. The censorious critic is a fault finder who is negative and destructive toward other people and enjoys actively seeking out their failures. He puts the worst possible construction on their motives, pours cold water on their plans, and is ungenerous towards them in their mistakes. End quote. That's what Jesus is forbidding. He's not just forbidding sort of thinking analytically or discerningly about people. He's talking about doing that in a super nasty, fault-finding way. Take a look at verse 2. He explains why we ought not to be judging. "For in the way that you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you." So rather than be the judge, we're going to be judged if we ourselves are judgmental of other people, harsh and nasty about them. If we set ourselves up as a judge, it implies that we have a more precise or more broad understanding of God's word and God's standards, that we ourselves have a higher degree of being able to apply it to ourselves, and that we are in a position then to sort of dictate very harshly how others ought to live. Well, God's going to view and judge those who are judgmental with that greater level of strictness. I think, by the way, God has very high standards for us. I think God, at the same time, is remarkably gracious to us. And so we need to try to live up to those high standards, and without in any way being soft on sin, we need to understand that when we are really trying to live up to those standards in the power of the Spirit, and we don't do so well, God's kind and merciful to us. The problem is sometimes people are more demanding and nasty than God is. Have you ever noticed that? That's hurtful when that happens. And so the person who is that kind of a harsh, judgmental individual, God is going to actually judge them by the standard of judgment that they require other people to live by. And in many cases, that's almost an impossibly high standard. So Jesus says we shouldn't be judgmental because we're going to be judged if we are. And he says we must judge ourselves in verses 3 through 5. And so the picture here that he gives is actually kind of a funny picture. In verse 3, he says, "Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and behold, the log is in your own eye?" Now, for the first time ever, I brought a prop. Imagine somebody coming up to you, a harsh, judgmental person, and they're going to come up to you and say, I should use this eye maybe. So they come up to you and say, you know what, I don't really, the way you did that thing the other day, I don't really like that. Let me come along. Let me just make some suggestions on how you shouldn't be doing that anymore, and you should do it this way instead. And so, in essence now, using Jesus' figure here, now he's going to try to take some little tiny problem out of somebody else's eye when he's got this honking thing sticking out of his own. How easy would it be to do that? How if I had my surgery and the doctor walked in like this, that would make me very nervous. It really would. So what are we supposed to do? So a person comes along and they look at some flaw in somebody else, even if it's small, and they have the audacity to want to take that out of their eye, when in point of fact, they also have tons of issues themselves that they need to be dealing with. In my experience in Christian circles, I have found that it is so easy for so many of us to look at the shortcomings of somebody else and to focus upon their shortcomings and to look at them and to want to criticize them. And it is very difficult for many of us to turn the spotlight on ourselves and to begin to consider what is there day by day and moment by moment that I need to be getting rid of in my own life. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. We've got these logs. We have these issues. And before we're going to be effective at helping remove the moral flaws and the moral failings of somebody else, we've got to have this thing removed. It means we have to do it. And I want to suggest that when we actually do that, when we take the time to have the humility and the teachableness to take out of our lives our own shortcomings, or to begin to try to really deal with those things, that's when we can become more effective in helping others. If I see somebody who is struggling with a particular sin issue, and let's suppose I've already struggled with that and have got some modicum of progress made in that particular area, I've taken the log out of my eye, probably not perfectly. I don't know that that'll ever happen until the resurrection. But where I'm trying to take the log out of my own eye, and I've made some progress, then guess what? I'm going to be more capable of being able to do that for them. But if I haven't examined myself, if I haven't dealt with me on some of these things, it's going to be much more difficult for me to do that very well for somebody else. So when we're critical of others, when we're prone to judge them and insist on making them change their own faults, without recognizing that we might have our own needs that need to be addressed, then we are trying to experience the pleasure of self-righteousness without the pain of self-discipline. Here's what I mean by that. Sometimes and we don't, I think a lot of times we don't do this consciously, but we do it anyway. Sometimes it's fun to find fault with somebody else and to sort of pick at them like that secretary in Yucaipa, California did to us. Because sometimes you find fault with somebody and you talk about it with other people, it sort of makes you feel a little bit morally superior. If you find fault with somebody, maybe you stab them behind their back or whatever, there's sort of an implicit thing here that says, they do that, but I don't do that. I can't believe they do that. They're terrible. I'm not that way. And so what happens is that their view of themselves, their feelings about themselves can rise. They can bring themselves pleasure in a sense of, I've got some sort of moral superiority. But they've tried to get there without the rigors of their own self-discipline. And that's where real growth comes. That's where real moral progress takes place, is as we deal with issues in our own lives, and then the Lord uses us genuinely to help others in perhaps those same areas. That's where satisfaction comes. That's where a sense of edification arises from. But not just finding fault to make ourselves feel good and look good. So I just want to stop here for a second. I just want to see, are you guys tracking with me with what I'm saying on this stuff? If you're tracking, just nod your head. Okay, if you're asleep, you can lay down now in the pew. That'd be okay. So Jesus goes on, and he says, "You hypocrite." Well, here's why the person who would do this, who doesn't recognize their own flaws and tries to be the moral corrector of everybody else and the moral critic of everybody else around them, they're a hypocrite because on one level, it looks like they're trying to help the other person maybe. But in point of fact, they might actually be using the criticism of another person and supposedly the help rendered to them to actually make themselves look morally superior. That would be a hypocritical thing. The act of trying to help somebody get a speck out of their eye would be an act of love. But if I do that to make myself look good, then I'm being hypocritical. So Jesus says, "You hypocrite." Wow. Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Baby Jesus. He says, "You hypocrite." That's what he says. First, take the log out of your own eye. Then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. What I want to suggest is that we need to engage in a healthy, regular regimen of self-examination, where we're willing to address the issues in our life that are subpar as Christians, and that we try to ratchet back our criticism of others who don't live up to our standards. They may live up to God's standards pretty well, but maybe not to ours. That we should be 3 times harder on ourselves than we ever are on anybody else, ever, in my opinion. And if we would do that, we would be so much more effective in helping them when they really do struggle. So, in Psalm 51 and verse 10, it says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Restore to me the joy of thy salvation, and sustain me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors thy ways, and sinners will be converted to thee." But notice the order. Lord, help me deal with my own sin. Help me to handle my own baggage. And as you do, then I'm going to be able to help others. So Jesus says we shouldn't be judgmental. He does say in verse 6, here's the second attitude we need to consider, that we should be discerning. So if we're not to be judgmental toward people, neither are we to be completely blind to their faults. We're not to be either judges or stupid about them. So he says in verse 6, "Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." Now, dogs and pigs were considered to be unclean animals by the Jewish people. You didn't feed a piece of meat from a sacrifice to a dog, nor would you give a pearl to pigs. The dogs are junkyard dogs. These are mongrels. These are curs. So who are these people? Jesus is not talking about animals. Who are these people? What's the holy thing that you don't give to dogs? What's the pearl or pearls that you don't give to swine? Well, I want to suggest that it's probably, in context, the correction that we might kindly give to somebody who really does have a moral flaw. Just like Jesus has just talked about it. That after we have taken steps largely to remove the log from our own eye, and we're willing then to help serve others, in some situations it might not be a good idea to try to help somebody else. In this case, it would be along the lines of Proverbs 9:8, which says, "Do not reprove a scoffer, lest he hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you." Sometimes you don't always go and try to help somebody deal with their issues, because sometimes some people are so unteachable that they'll just be nasty to you as you try to legitimately and genuinely help them. But it requires wisdom to be able to do that. In Acts chapter 13, verses 44 to 46, and in verse 51, it says, "The next Sabbath, nearly the whole city assembled to hear the word of the Lord. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and began contradicting the things spoken by Paul and were blaspheming. Paul and Barnabas spoke out boldly and said it was necessary that the word of God be spoken to you first. Since you repudiate it and judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life, behold, we are turning to the Gentiles." In verse 51 it says that Paul and Barnabas shook off the dust of their feet in protest against them and went to Iconium. See, when a Jewish person would travel through a Gentile land, as they were coming back into a Jewish territory, they would knock the dust off of their shoes, off their feet, off their clothing, because it was dust it was Gentile dust. It was dust gathered from a Gentile area. And you didn't want to take Gentile unclean dust into a Jewish area because you would render the Jewish area unclean. And so for these Jewish people, when Paul and Barnabas knocked the dust off of them and off of their feet, they are saying, you guys are like Gentiles. You're outside the covenant of God. God's going to judge you. But Paul and Barnabas had the discernment to say, you know what? It's pointless for us to stay here to try to verbally go toe-to-toe with these people because apparently it's not going to do any good. That's pretty harsh. The thing is, it requires wisdom and insight to know when to do that. And that's the third point. We should be humble. Humble here means that while we're trying to remove the speck from a brother's eye, or trying to discern when we should not cast what is holy to dogs or pearls before swine, that we need to do this with an attitude of total dependence upon the Lord for His wisdom and guidance. Hence the need for prayer, verse 9. Jesus says, "What man is there among you when his son shall ask him for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he?" Notice in verse 7, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds. And to him who knocks it will be opened." See, the thing is we're interacting with people and they seem to be very resistant to the gospel. We need to ask God for insight as to whether or not to kind of continue that relationship and to try to do that. And this is going to sound shocking. I think sometimes we have to reach a point where we realize, even though we don't want it to be this way, that somebody that we desperately want to share the gospel with and we want to have trust Christ becomes so adamantly opposed to us, maybe verbally abusive. I don't think it's wrong to pull the plug on that aspect of our relationship then. They are not beyond the realm of possibility of being saved. God can still work in their hearts. But I'm not altogether convinced that we are obligated to maintain the kind of relationship with somebody no matter how nasty their reaction to us might be. But in order to make that decision, it requires us asking from God, seeking the wisdom from Him that we need to be able to make that determination. And verses 9 and 10 indicate that God will provide that for us. You know, in the same way that a dad, if his child is hungry, won't give him a stone. By the way, when you guys come with me to Israel, which you should do, it's God's will for everybody to go to Israel, you know, and it is. If you go just outside of Jerusalem a little bit, out east of the Mount of Olives, you're in the Judean wilderness. All the rocks there are sort of this light brown tan color and look exactly, apparently, like loaves of bread that were how they were baked in the first century. And so you're thinking, well, you know, bread and a stone. Well, in those days, the stones looked like bread. Well, no dad would ever give his kid a stone that looked like a piece of bread. We could break his teeth on it or something. And the point is that God is not going to do that for us either. If we ask Him for wisdom and insight as to whether or not to be able to share the faith and to try to help people grow, and they're blowing us off and nasty to us, God's going to give us the wisdom that we need to make the determination of whether or not we should continue along those lines. I think that's the nature of this promise. A fish, by the way, fish they have scales, most fish. Snakes have scales also. If you fillet a fish and you fillet a snake, they could look very similar. The thing is, according to Leviticus 11:12, snakes were unclean animals. You didn't eat them. And so what dad would ever give a kid a fillet of snake and render him unclean? He would never do that. He's going to provide what the child needs. God will provide for us the kind of insight and wisdom we need. Verse 11, so then, if you being evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more shall your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? And again, I think in context, we're especially talking about how we ought to be interacting with the people around us. So Jesus says that we're not to be judgmental of the people around us who are not behaving as they should. We're not to be judgmental, but we are to be discerning. We need to be asking, we need to be humble and ask God to help us to make the determination of whether or not we should even bother to try to take the speck out of their eye in a kind way. But Jesus also says, this is number 4, we should be gracious, verse 12. In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. This, by the way, might be the best known verse in all the Bible. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is how the King James says it. This is the golden rule. And I think it's a great, great, great rule. One of the things that we have to be asking ourselves all the time as we interact with people, and sometimes it's important for us to be confrontive, but to do it firmly in love. Sometimes we have to do that. We need to ask ourselves the question, okay, so when I interacted with that person that way, would I have wanted somebody else to have interacted with me that way? And a lot of times I'll ask people, you know, if who have done something nasty to somebody else, I'll ask them, if somebody else had treated you that way, would you like it? And inevitably they'll say no. Then I'm going to say, you just violated the golden rule. Because this is binding upon us as well. So the way you want to be treated, that's how we ought to be treating other people as well. We need to keep that in mind. So, here's my application. And believe it or not, I have a PowerPoint slide. Woohoo! Thank you, Lexi Belvis. So the next time that you are outraged by an apparent sin of another Christian, somebody else who's acting the way they shouldn't be acting as a believer, ask yourself these 4 questions. And by the way, this is in your bulletin. And there's even blanks that if you're inclined, you could fill in. Hint, 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 hint. Okay, you guys see it in the outline in the bulletin? All right, we should ask ourselves a question. Has this person actually committed a sin? A sin. There. I mean, this is something that's important for us to keep in mind. You know, if they just acted in a way that we don't prefer or doesn't fit our taste, then we probably ought not to be doing a whole lot in terms of confrontation. Second, am I being harsh, judgmental, or hasty in my reaction to this person? Am I being harsh, judgmental, or hasty in my reaction to this person? And so oftentimes, so many of us, we heat up. Oh man, we heat up just like that. We see something we don't like, and we go 0 to 60 with our anger. Like they did that. You know, come on, guys. Let's just chill a little bit. Let's be gracious. Am I being harsh, judgmental, or hasty in my reaction to this person? Third, have I ever been guilty of the same kind of sin myself? And I would propose that that most of the time we probably would have to say, yeah. Almost anything other people have done that we don't like, we probably would be guilty of it as well. And then number 4, how would I want to be treated in this situation? How would I want somebody to treat me if I choked and done something stupid or sinful? How would I want to be treated? Then that's how we ought to treat them. If we go to talk with them and reprove, correct them, and we do it in love. This is how we ought to be treating those who don't act the way Jesus would want them to act based on the Sermon on the Mount.